I never imagined that doing one simple favor for a neighbor would end with an official letter telling me I had 30 days to leave the home I had worked 10 years to afford. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that morning, I believed our quiet subdivision was the kind of place where people looked out for one another instead of looking for reasons to turn kindness into a violation. The envelope was waiting in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo and marked as urgent. At first, I thought it had to be another community newsletter or maybe a reminder about landscaping. Instead, I unfolded a notice claiming I had committed repeated violations serious enough to begin the process of removing me from the neighborhood. I read every line twice, then a third time, certain someone had mixed up my address with another homeowner's. The accusations sounded unreal. According to the letter, I had interfered with community property, ignored official warnings, and created an ongoing disruption. None of it made sense. The only unusual thing I had done all month was help my elderly neighbor, Margaret Ellis, carry a few heavy storage boxes from her garage after she mentioned her back had been bothering her. I stood on my driveway staring at the paper while the quiet sounds of lawn sprinklers and distant birds suddenly felt strangely distant. Across the street, a few neighbors slowed their morning walks just enough to glance in my direction before continuing on. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It felt like they already knew something I didn't. That's when I noticed Linda Brooks, the HOA president, standing near the community entrance with a clipboard tucked against her arm. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She was simply watching. When our eyes met, she offered a brief smile that never reached her eyes before turning away. That single moment unsettled me more than the letter itself. 3 days earlier, everything had seemed perfectly normal. Margaret had waved me over while I was bringing my trash bin back from the curb. She apologized for interrupting my morning and asked if I could help move several boxes she couldn't safely lift. It took less than 15 minutes. We laughed about how every garage somehow filled with things nobody remembered buying. Before I left, she thanked me with a bottle of cold lemonade and told me neighbors like me reminded her why she had stayed in the community after her husband passed away. As I walked back toward my house, Linda had driven slowly past us in her golf cart, looking from the open garage to the stacked boxes without saying a word. I barely thought about it at the time. Looking back, I realized that silent glance was where everything had begun. Later that afternoon, I found my first violation notice taped neatly to my front door. It claimed I had performed unauthorized work on another homeowner's property. I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. I assumed one phone call would clear everything up. Instead, every attempt to explain only seemed to create another complaint. A second notice arrived the next day, then a fine, then another warning referencing a pattern of noncompliance I didn't even know existed. Standing there with the eviction notice in my hands, I finally understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Someone wanted me gone, and all I had done was help a neighbor who needed a hand. The next morning, I decided that the only way to stop the situation from getting worse was to speak with Linda Brooks face to face. I walked to the community office carrying every notice I had received, convinced that once she heard the full story, the mistake would finally be corrected. Instead, she barely glanced at the papers before sliding another document across the desk. It was a formal request for a compliance meeting scheduled later that week. I asked what rule I had actually broken. She answered by pointing to a section of the community handbook and saying that residents were not allowed to perform unapproved work affecting another property. I explained again that I had simply carried several storage boxes for Margaret Ellis because she could not lift them herself. Linda replied that intentions were not the issue. She claimed that moving items inside another homeowner's garage without prior approval could create liability concerns for the association. The explanation sounded so unreasonable that I thought she had to be joking, but her expression never changed. When I left the office, I noticed two neighbors quietly watching through the front window before turning away as if they did not want to be seen. By lunchtime, I realized news of the dispute had spread much faster than I expected. A man who usually waved every morning offered only a brief nod. Another neighbor who often chatted while walking her dog crossed to the opposite side of the street. Nobody said anything openly, yet the silence felt louder than any argument. That afternoon, Margaret knocked on my front door looking worried. She apologized over and over, insisting she never imagined her request for help would cause problems. I assured her she had done nothing wrong and that she should not blame herself. She hesitated before mentioning something that immediately caught my attention. She said Linda had visited her the previous evening and asked several questions about what had happened in the garage. Margaret had answered honestly, but she felt as though every answer had been interpreted in the worst possible way. Before leaving, Linda had suggested that helping neighbors was admirable as long as people stayed within proper procedures. Margaret admitted that statement confused her because she had never heard of such procedures for carrying personal belongings. Later that evening, I reviewed every page of the community handbook. I highlighted every section related to homeowner responsibilities, shared spaces, and property maintenance. Nothing resembled the interpretation Linda had described. The more carefully I read, the more convinced I became that something else was happening beneath the surface. Just before sunset, my doorbell camera sent a notification to my phone. A board member named Robert Hayes had quietly placed another envelope near my front door before walking away without knocking. Inside was an updated notice stating that additional complaints had been received from unnamed residents. No names, no dates, and no specific incidents were listed. As I stood on my porch holding the paper, I realized this had moved far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Someone was building a story about me piece by piece, and unless I discovered why, every new day would make it harder to convince anyone of the truth. By the time the compliance meeting arrived, I had organized every notice, every email, and every page of the community handbook into a neat folder. I walked into the clubhouse expecting a conversation, but the atmosphere felt more like a decision had already been made before I entered the room. Linda Brooks sat at one end of the table with Robert Hayes beside her, while two additional board members quietly reviewed documents without looking in my direction. Linda began by summarizing the complaints as though they were established facts instead of allegations. She spoke about repeated disregard for community standards, unauthorized activity on another homeowner's property, and behavior that supposedly created concern among residents. When she finished, I calmly asked for one simple thing. I wanted to know who had filed the complaints and exactly what actions they claimed I had taken. Linda responded that homeowner identities would remain confidential and that the board considered the written report sufficient. I explained that I could not respond to accusations that contained no details, but my words seemed to disappear into the room without changing anyone's expression. As the meeting ended, I was handed another document requiring immediate compliance with rules that still had not been clearly explained. Walking back outside, I noticed Sarah Mitchell standing near the community garden. She hesitated before approaching me, glancing toward the clubhouse as if she wanted to make sure nobody was watching. In a quiet voice, she admitted she had been surprised by everything she had heard. She told me she had driven past Margaret's house the morning I helped move the boxes and had not seen anything unusual. According to Sarah, it looked exactly like one neighbor helping another for a few minutes before going home. She apologized for not speaking sooner because she assumed the misunderstanding would disappear on its own. Her words gave me the first sense that not everyone believed the story spreading through the neighborhood. Before leaving, she mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. The community entrance camera pointed directly toward the street where Margaret's driveway was located. If the recording still existed, it might show everything that actually happened that morning. That possibility stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. I sent a polite written request asking whether the association could preserve any available security footage from that date until the matter was resolved. Several hours later, I received a brief reply stating that camera records were maintained according to routine procedures and that no additional action would be taken. The response felt strangely rushed. That evening, Margaret stopped by carrying a small notebook. She explained that after her husband passed away, she had started writing down important events to help remember appointments and conversations. She opened to the page from the day I helped her. The entry listed the exact time I arrived, the number of boxes we moved, and even the fact that she had given me a bottle of lemonade before I returned home. It was a simple personal note, yet it matched my own memory perfectly. As I thanked her, a delivery truck slowed near the curb before continuing down the street. The driver was not making a delivery. He was simply turning around, but for a brief moment I caught another glimpse of Linda's golf cart parked near the clubhouse. She appeared to be watching the street again. I no longer believed this was about a misunderstanding of community rules. Someone seemed determined to control the narrative before the facts had a chance to speak for themselves. And now, for the first time, I believe there might be evidence capable of changing everything. The following morning, I decided to stop reacting and start documenting everything. I created a timeline beginning with the day Margaret asked for help and added every notice, email, and conversation that followed. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Each new complaint appeared only after I questioned the previous one, as though simply asking for clarification was being treated as another violation. While I was organizing my notes, Sarah Mitchell called and asked if we could meet at the small park near the community entrance. When I arrived, she looked around before speaking quietly. She told me that several neighbors had privately admitted they had never filed complaints against me, even though the board kept referring to concerns from multiple residents. Nobody wanted to become involved because they feared drawing attention to themselves, but more than one person believed the situation had gone too far. Before we finished talking, another neighbor named David Reynolds approached us. I knew him only well enough to exchange friendly waves, so I was surprised when he asked if he could add something. He explained that his home security camera covered part of the street leading to Margaret's driveway. He had never thought the recording mattered until he heard about the accusations spreading through the neighborhood. David invited us to his house and opened the video from that morning. The footage was simple but clear. It showed my truck pulling into Margaret's driveway shortly after 9 o'clock. A few minutes later, the camera captured Margaret opening her garage while we carried several storage boxes from one side of the garage to the other. There was no damage, no argument, no crowd gathering, and nothing resembling the description written in the notices. Less than 20 minutes later, I walked back to my truck holding nothing except the empty cooler Margaret had used to bring me a bottle of lemonade. As the recording continued, another detail appeared that none of us expected. A community golf cart slowly passed the driveway while we were still moving the final box. The driver was unmistakably Linda Brooks. She slowed almost to a stop, looked toward the open garage for several seconds, and then continued down the street. She had witnessed the entire interaction with her own eyes. Sarah looked at me without saying a word because we were both thinking the same thing. If Linda had personally observed what happened, then the official description in the violation notices could not have been based on a misunderstanding. David immediately offered to save a copy of the recording in case the original system automatically deleted older files. I thanked him and asked whether he would be willing to confirm when the video had been recorded if necessary. After a brief pause, he agreed. He admitted he had stayed quiet because he did not want conflict with the board, but he also said he could not ignore clear evidence if someone was being treated unfairly. That afternoon, I sent another respectful email requesting that the board review the newly discovered footage before taking any further action. Several hours passed without a response. Instead, another certified letter arrived before sunset informing me that the compliance process would continue as scheduled and that failure to cooperate could result in additional penalties. There was no mention of my request, no acknowledgement that new evidence existed, and no invitation to discuss the facts. As I placed the unopened envelope beside the growing stack on my kitchen table, I realized something important had changed. Until now, I had been trying to prove I had done nothing wrong. From this point forward, the evidence was beginning to raise a far more difficult question about why someone seemed determined to ignore the truth even after it was placed directly in front of them. The next several days changed the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood in ways I never expected. Instead of making me doubt myself, every new step taken by the board seemed to uncover another piece of information that raised even more questions. David Reynolds copied the security footage onto 2 separate drives and kept one for himself, explaining that he did not want an accidental technical problem to erase something so important. Sarah Mitchell quietly spoke with several longtime residents who remembered other situations where simple disagreements had somehow turned into formal complaints. None of them described anything as serious as my case, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. Small misunderstandings had often become official issues only after someone challenged a decision made by the board. Margaret continued to apologize each time we spoke, but I reminded her that kindness was never the problem. The real issue was that facts were being pushed aside in favor of assumptions. A few days later, I received another certified letter asking me to attend a second compliance meeting. Unlike the first notice, this one claimed the board had gathered additional information supporting its earlier conclusions. I arrived carrying my folder, the community handbook, copies of every email, Margaret's notebook entry, and David's recorded footage. Linda Brooks welcomed everyone with the same calm confidence she had shown before, then announced that the association had expanded its review after hearing from more concerned homeowners. I politely asked whether those concerns referred to first-hand observations or simply conversations that occurred after the notices had already been distributed. The room became noticeably quieter. Linda avoided answering directly and instead repeated that the board had the responsibility to protect community standards. I requested permission to present the security footage before any further discussion continued. After a brief exchange among the board members, Linda reluctantly agreed. David connected his laptop to the meeting room display, and the recording played from beginning to end. Nobody interrupted. The video showed exactly what we already knew. Margaret opened her garage. I carried a few storage boxes. We smiled, spoke for a moment, and I left. Then the camera clearly captured Linda slowly driving past the property while everything was taking place. As soon as the recording ended, one board member leaned forward and quietly asked whether this was the complete file. David confirmed that it was copied directly from his home security system without edits. For the first time since the entire situation began, Robert Hayes looked genuinely uncomfortable. Instead of discussing the contents of the recording, Linda suggested that the meeting should focus on broader concerns about homeowner conduct. That response surprised even some of the people sitting beside her. Sarah calmly pointed out that the footage directly addressed the original allegation and deserved consideration before any new claims were introduced. Another board member nodded in agreement. The meeting ended without a decision, but something had clearly shifted. As residents walked toward the parking lot, several people approached me privately. One thanked me for remaining respectful throughout the process. Another admitted that the stories circulating around the neighborhood had sounded much worse than anything shown in the recording. Even neighbors who did not openly take sides seemed less willing to accept every accusation without question. Later that evening, I received an unexpected phone call from a former board volunteer who had heard about the meeting. He said there might be archived correspondence from previous years showing that community guidelines had never been interpreted the way Linda was describing them now. He offered to search through his old files over the weekend. When the call ended, I realized that every attempt to strengthen the case against me had produced the opposite result. What began as a single favor for a neighbor was slowly uncovering a much larger story, and for the first time I believed the truth was beginning to find its own voice. 2 days after the second meeting, I received a call that completely changed the direction of everything. The former board volunteer introduced himself as Michael Turner and asked if we could meet at a small coffee shop just outside the neighborhood. When I arrived, he placed a worn file folder on the table and explained that he had served on the architectural committee several years earlier. He had kept copies of old newsletters, meeting summaries, and policy memos because he believed homeowners deserved transparency. As we sorted through the papers, one document immediately stood out. It was a written clarification distributed to board members years before, explaining that neighbors helping one another with ordinary household tasks did not require approval from the association as long as no permanent property changes were involved. The wording was remarkably clear. Carrying furniture, moving storage boxes, or assisting elderly residents had never been considered violations. Michael looked at me and quietly said that he could not understand why anyone would now describe those actions differently. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Officer Daniel Ruiz from the local police department. He explained that someone connected with the neighborhood had requested an officer be present at the next community meeting because there were concerns that tensions between residents might continue to rise. He emphasized that no criminal allegation existed and that his role would simply be to help keep the meeting calm if needed. Even so, hearing that outside authorities were now aware of the situation made it impossible to dismiss everything as a simple disagreement. Later that afternoon, I received another email from the board confirming the upcoming public meeting. This time the notice stated that homeowners would be allowed to observe the discussion. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. People who had barely spoken to me for days suddenly began offering polite greetings again. Some admitted they wanted to hear both sides before forming opinions. Others quietly asked whether the security video everyone was talking about would actually be shown. The atmosphere had shifted from suspicion to curiosity. Margaret called that evening and sounded more hopeful than she had in weeks. She told me several neighbors had stopped by to check on her after hearing that evidence might finally be reviewed in front of the community. She also remembered another detail that neither of us had considered before. On the morning I helped move the boxes, a package had been delivered to her front porch. She still had the delivery confirmation showing the exact time, matching both her notebook and David Reynolds' security recording. It was another small piece of information, but it strengthened the timeline even further. The night before the meeting, I organized everything once again. The security footage, Margaret's handwritten notes, the package delivery record, the old policy clarification from Michael Turner, every email I had exchanged with the board, and every notice I had received were arranged in chronological order. Looking across the stack of documents, I realized the story told by the evidence was remarkably simple. A neighbor had asked for help. Another neighbor had provided it. Everything that followed had been built upon a version of events that the available records simply did not support. The following evening, the clubhouse parking lot filled much earlier than usual. Residents gathered in small groups, quietly discussing what they expected to hear. Near the entrance, I noticed Officer Daniel Ruiz speaking calmly with several board members before greeting homeowners as they arrived. His presence reminded everyone that the meeting would remain respectful and orderly. As I stepped through the clubhouse doors carrying the folder that had grown thicker with every passing day, I understood that this would be the first time the entire community would hear the complete story instead of scattered rumors. And I had a feeling that once every piece was placed together, it would become much harder for anyone to ignore what had really happened. The meeting began with an unusual silence that settled over the clubhouse as every chair filled. Homeowners who rarely attended monthly gatherings stood along the back wall because there was no space left to sit. Officer Daniel Ruiz remained near the entrance with a calm expression, greeting people as they arrived and quietly reminding everyone that the discussion should remain respectful. Linda Brooks opened the meeting by reviewing the same list of alleged violations that had appeared in every notice I had received, but this time her words no longer carried the same certainty. She knew the room expected more than accusations. When she finished speaking, one of the board members asked whether I wished to respond. I stood, thanked everyone for allowing me to speak, and placed my folder on the table. Instead of arguing, I simply arranged each document in chronological order. I began with Margaret Ellis's handwritten notebook entry, followed by the package delivery confirmation showing the exact time she received her shipment that morning. Next came David Reynolds' security recording, which was displayed once again on the large screen. The room remained completely quiet as everyone watched the footage from beginning to end. There I was carrying several storage boxes from one side of Margaret's garage to the other before accepting a bottle of lemonade and walking back home. Then the camera captured Linda slowly driving past and looking directly toward us while everything was happening. Nobody needed an explanation because the video spoke for itself. After the recording ended, Michael Turner handed copies of the old board policy clarification to every current board member. The document clearly explained that neighbors helping one another with ordinary household tasks did not require association approval and had never been classified as a violation under community guidelines. One board member carefully compared the document with the language quoted in the recent notices before looking toward Linda with visible confusion. Sarah Mitchell then stood and described exactly what she had witnessed while driving through the neighborhood that morning. Her account matched the video in every meaningful detail. David confirmed that the recording had been preserved directly from his home security system without modification. Margaret quietly explained that she had simply asked for help because lifting the boxes alone would have been difficult for her. As each person spoke, the story remained consistent. No detail conflicted with another. The questions from the audience gradually changed. Instead of asking what I had done, homeowners began asking why the violation process had continued after evidence had become available. Linda answered that the board had relied upon information presented at the time, but one resident politely pointed out that the video showed she had personally driven past the property during the event itself. Another homeowner asked why later requests to review additional evidence had received no meaningful response. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even Robert Hayes appeared uncomfortable as he reviewed the documents in front of him once again. Officer Daniel Ruiz never interrupted because there was no need. The discussion remained calm, organized, and focused entirely on the facts. Before the meeting ended, one of the board members proposed pausing every enforcement action until an independent review of the entire file could be completed. Another immediately agreed. The motion passed after a brief discussion, and for the first time since the notices had begun arriving at my house, I felt the direction of the story changing. The evidence had done exactly what I hoped it would do. It had shifted the conversation away from rumors and assumptions and toward facts that everyone in the room could see with their own eyes, leaving the community to consider not whether I had broken the rules, but how the situation had reached this point in the first place. 3 days after the community meeting, every homeowner received an email announcing a special board session to review the findings from the independent committee. Unlike the earlier notices, this message included copies of the documents that had been discussed during the meeting, allowing every resident to read the timeline for themselves. The effect was immediate. Conversations that had once been driven by rumors were now centered on facts. Neighbors who had quietly avoided me for weeks began stopping by my driveway to ask how I was holding up. Several admitted they had accepted the original claims because they assumed the board had carefully verified everything before taking action. Now they realized how easily incomplete information could shape an entire neighborhood. When the special session began, the atmosphere felt completely different from every previous meeting. There was no sense that the outcome had already been decided. The independent committee presented its review step by step. They confirmed that the security recording matched Margaret Ellis's written notes, the delivery confirmation, and every statement provided by the witnesses. They also confirmed that the archived policy memorandum Michael Turner had preserved accurately reflected the community guidelines that were in effect when I helped Margaret. Most importantly, they found no evidence supporting the original claim that I had performed unauthorized work or violated any association rule. One committee member explained that the available records consistently showed a simple act of neighborly assistance rather than any prohibited activity. The room remained silent as each conclusion was read into the record. Then another finding changed everything. The committee reported that several of the later violation notices relied on interpretations that were inconsistent with the association's own written policies. While they avoided assigning personal motives, they concluded that the enforcement process should never have advanced beyond the initial review once the available facts had been examined. Several board members exchanged long, uneasy looks before one of them thanked the committee for conducting a thorough evaluation. Robert Hayes slowly stood and acknowledged that the board had a responsibility to correct mistakes when they occurred. He proposed withdrawing every notice, every fine, and every enforcement action connected to my case. The motion passed unanimously. Linda Brooks remained quiet throughout most of the discussion. When she finally spoke, her remarks were brief. She stated that the board had acted based on information it believed to be accurate at the time, but she accepted the committee's conclusions and agreed that the official record should be corrected. The statement did not erase everything that had happened, yet hearing those words marked a turning point for the entire community. The threat hanging over my home disappeared with a single vote. After the meeting ended, homeowners gathered outside the clubhouse instead of leaving immediately. Margaret smiled with visible relief and thanked everyone who had taken the time to listen before reaching conclusions. Sarah Mitchell remarked that the neighborhood felt different already because people were talking openly instead of whispering behind closed doors. David Reynolds joked that he never expected an ordinary home security camera to become the most discussed piece of equipment in the subdivision. Even Officer Daniel Ruiz, who had attended only as an observer, quietly commented that respectful conversations supported by clear facts usually led to better outcomes than assumptions ever could. As I walked home beneath the evening sky, I realized that the greatest change was not simply that my record had been cleared. The balance of trust within the neighborhood had shifted. Decisions would no longer be accepted without questions, evidence would matter more than rumors, and the simple act of helping a neighbor had unexpectedly reminded an entire community that fairness depended on listening before judging. The weeks that followed felt almost unreal because the neighborhood slowly returned to the place I had always believed it could be. The certified letters stopped arriving. My mailbox once again held nothing more exciting than utility bills and grocery store coupons, and the quiet morning walks that had once been filled with uncomfortable silence gradually became friendly conversations again. People no longer lowered their voices when I walked by. Instead, they waved, smiled, and often stopped to ask how Margaret was doing. She had become something of a symbol in the community, not because she wanted attention, but because everyone understood that one simple request for help had exposed a much larger lesson about fairness, trust, and the importance of listening before reaching conclusions. At the next monthly community meeting, several homeowners proposed creating a volunteer neighbor assistance program so residents who needed help with small household tasks could easily ask without feeling embarrassed. The idea received overwhelming support. Ironically, the very act that had started months of unnecessary conflict was now being recognized as something worth encouraging rather than discouraging. Michael Turner volunteered to help review outdated community guidelines so they would be written more clearly, leaving less room for confusion in the future. Sarah Mitchell joined the committee as a homeowner representative, explaining that open communication was the best way to prevent similar situations from happening again. David Reynolds joked that his security cameras had unexpectedly become neighborhood celebrities, earning laughter from nearly everyone in the room. Even that shared laughter felt meaningful because it reminded all of us how tense the atmosphere had once been. Margaret eventually invited several neighbors over for coffee one Saturday afternoon. Instead of discussing complaints or notices, everyone shared stories about the first time someone in the neighborhood had helped them after moving in. Listening to those conversations made me realize that kindness had always been part of this community. It had simply been overshadowed for a while by fear, assumptions, and silence. As for Linda Brooks, she attended fewer meetings over the following months and spoke much less than before. Other board members gradually took a more collaborative approach, encouraging homeowners to ask questions and offering written explanations whenever new policies were discussed. The meetings became shorter, calmer, and noticeably more productive because people no longer felt as though they had to choose sides. Looking back, I often thought about the moment I first opened that letter claiming I could lose my home. At the time, it felt as though everything I had worked for was slipping away because of something completely beyond my control. If I had responded with anger instead of patience, or assumptions instead of evidence, the outcome might have been very different. Instead, every conversation, every document, every witness, and every simple fact slowly built a clearer picture until the truth became impossible to ignore. That experience changed the way I looked at communities forever. Rules can help neighborhoods function well, but they only work when they are applied with fairness, transparency, and common sense. The strongest neighborhoods are not built by perfectly trimmed lawns or neatly painted fences. They are built by people who are willing to carry a few heavy boxes for a neighbor without expecting anything in return, people who speak honestly when they witness the truth, and people who are willing to admit mistakes when the facts become clear. Every time I walk past Margaret's house now, she smiles from her front porch and waves with the same warmth she showed me on the day she first asked for help. That simple wave reminds me that no official notice, no rumor, and no misunderstanding can ever outweigh the quiet strength of ordinary neighbors choosing to do the right thing for one another.